Okay, ladies and gentlemen, here we are with our little state. We have our territory, our population, our government, and of course, our sovereignty. And we have the three things the government does, which is to derive legitimacy from the people, that they have the right to rule through their authority, and then, of course, they use their power, their ability to rule. Our focus on this one is the concept of the use of power and how you solve problems with your country by distributing that power to different entities. Okay, so let's first understand that we're talking about unitary, federal, and confederate governments here. This is the three different ways that a government system distributes power within the state. Okay, let's start with this. First of all, in comparative politics, we have something called a cleavage. And a cleavage is any social or cultural division within society. Most commonly, we're going to see this as ethnic. So in the UK, your ethnic cleavage would be England and then against Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. In China, you have the Han Chinese versus the Tibetans or the Uyghurs. In Nigeria, you have the Hausa Fulani, Yoruba, and Igbo cleavage that happens. So these are all ethnic cleavages. Of course, you have religious cleavages. You have the Protestants, the Catholics, often Muslims and non-Muslims. When you're in a place like Iran, though, there's very few non-Muslims in Iran. Um, but all these things here are cleavages. So different cleavages. You see down here, real world example. If there's a terrorist attack and the citizens are terrified, then you have a cleavage of how safe versus how free you are. People wanting safety, people wanting security. Um, this is going to be like when Boko Haram attacks northern Nigeria. Over here, you have the global pandemic. Was there a cleavage in the pandemic? Well, sure. You had the people that thought that you needed to um, lock things down and make things safer, and during that time, the economy was struggling. So people were like, no, you have to open it up and let the economy go. So that's an example of a cleavage. But you also have other social pressures on the government that aren't necessarily cleavages, or they can be. So you have supranational organizations like the European Union pushing against the British government, which of course eventually led to Brexit. That was an example of a cleavage. You have external threats from other countries, so like Russia versus Ukraine. You have regional protests that things like what happened with the Troubles in Northern Ireland. You know, times of national emergency where the government comes in and starts to suppress things like freedoms and civil liberties. Of course, you have access to terrorism. Well, then how do we deal with all these cleavages and unrest and political instability? Well, you have to figure out a way to execute power within a country, and it could be a pretty fine balancing act. And we know that countries contains nations, and that most countries have some kind of charter or constitution to distribute that power. But understand there's different types of governments that can wield power. And the organization of the country is going to determine how that power is wielded. You have, of course, central governments. This is often your national or federal governments. You have your state, regional, or provisional governments. And you have your local governments, places like cities or counties or townships when you get back east in the United States, or shires when you get into places like the United Kingdom. Okay. Now, on a continuum of government power, we have strong central government on one side and weak central government on the other, where power is more sent to regions or localities. A unitary government has a strong central government. Then a federal government power is shared. When you get into a confederation, then you have a very weak central government. So let's look at these things more in detail. In a unitary government, power is held by one central authority. The central government can, at any time, create smaller governments and can remove smaller governments. And ultimately, the central government is the ultimate authority. This does not have to be a dictatorship. The United Kingdom has a unitary government, but it is democratically elected. However, most unitary governments, excuse me, most dictatorships, most authoritarian governments are more unitary than anything else. So a place like China, Iran, those are considered more unitary style governments where power comes from a central location, a national government. Now, this was going to be more what it looks like in graphic form. You have your regional authorities, you have your central authority. The central authority is far bigger, so it actually distributes power to regional authorities, but also can take that power back away. Okay. So, who has the power? Ultimately, the central government. Central government is the ultimate authority. Now, you can, when in the case of the United Kingdom, actually devolve power to smaller legislative assemblies in the regions. So, devolution, to devolve power, is the transfer of political power from a central to subnational government. But with devolution, that central government can actually take the power back away from you if it wanted to, because the central government is the central authority. So in the UK, we already know this works because the UK Parliament is the ultimate decider of law and the ultimate policymaker. But of course, you have the Northern Irish Assembly, Stormont, you have the Scottish Parliament, Holyrood, and you have the Welsh Parliament, the Senedd. And finally, you have the London Assembly. These are all devolved assemblies or parliaments that have power to run their local areas, but that power could be taken away and overruled by the UK Parliament. So the power is devolved, but it can be taken back because it is a unitary style government. Ultimately, the UK Parliament has power. A federal government is where power is, now notice, it's shared between one central government and the regional governments. So power here is shared. The regional governments actually have protected power, usually through a constitution, that cannot be abused by the central authority. The central government is powerful, but cannot simply like choose state leaders or dissolve the states when it doesn't do one at once, dissolve the regions. It actually has to share that power with the localized governments. So an example of this would be Mexico and Nigeria, which is your classic, and the United States are all federal governments. Russia has something called asymmetric federalism that we're going to get to here in a second. But notice the circles here in the graph, the central authority and the regional authorities all are the same size. They share power. Usually, that shared power is protected by a constitution, a charter, something that very specifically says the regional governments can do this, the central government can do this. Okay. And unlike in a unitary, remember, they share power. Power can't simply be taken away by the central government. Now, asymmetric federalism works in the Russian Federation like this. These are all, provincial. They're called, a lot of them are called oblasts. They are essentially provinces within Russia. They have their own governments, but what Russia saw was that it was too hard to be able to get their own political parties and the party of Putin, United Russia, to get voted in all of these elections. So they took the regions of Russia, and instead of having this many, they narrowed it down to this many, much smaller group, which is much easier to get one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, 8 different governments into power than all of these different governments into power. And why is the federalism asymmetric? Because one district, the central federal district, actually has far more power because it is connected to the Russian national government. So this regional government actually gets an like a disequilibrium in power. These areas, they do have their own power, but basically they're not nearly as powerful as one, the national government, but also this particular federal district, the central district, which is where Moscow is located. So the power isn't shared and even, it is asymmetric. It is uneven, geared towards one particular district, the central district. The final one is not in existence in the AP6, but you may have a question about it. And that is a confederation. This is where countries agree to work together to essentially solve problems, but they ultimately have a lot more sovereignty and more power than the alliance as a collective. Usually, all member regions are um, allied and they're equal, but the central government that they work through, it really doesn't have any teeth, doesn't have any power. The examples you're familiar with are the United States government in its Constitution version 1, which is called the Articles of Confederation between 1781 and 1789. And then, of course, the Confederation of Southern States, the Confederacy, which was a loose collection of states in, South Carolina, Virginia, North Carolina, Florida. But their national government at the Confederate level was super, super weak. The states essentially did what they felt like doing, much the same during the first iteration of the Constitution, which was the Articles of Confederation in the 1700s. So notice here, in a Confederate style government, the regional authorities are much stronger than the central authority. They have a greater sway over power and what goes on. Okay. So you have your continuum of government distribution of power trying to solve those cleavages, those national emergencies, those times of political instability. You have unitary governments where the central government has the most power. They can give power in the form of devolution to regional governments, but can take it away. You have a federal government where power is shared between the central authority and the regional authorities. That power is usually protected. It's important to put that into anything about federal governments. It is protected usually by a document, some kind of constitution. And finally, confederations, where the regional authorities are much more powerful than the central authority, and usually the regions are simply a loosely based alliance.